I'm Bill Deverell from the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West and the Collections Convergence Initiative here at the USC Libraries. It's a thrill to invite you or to have you, welcome you here. Thank you for coming. We're going to have a really rollicking, interesting day. I want to acknowledge my dear friend and colleague David Ulin over here, whose partnership in putting on these conferences is a real joy. This is, well, it's sort of the fourth, I guess, or even fifth thematic LA conference that we've put on, or symposium we've put on. There was one several years ago that maybe some of you attended, which was called Subterranean LA. Then there was Aerial LA, what's under our feet and what's over our heads. We also did one on science fiction and the city's contributions to the science fiction genre. And then we did a comparative one here and up in San Francisco on the literary communities of LA and San Francisco and how they're alike and different. So LA After Dark, or The City at Night, is the next iteration. This one's different because we have loved a new partnership with our colleagues across the street at the Natural History Museum. So I want to recognize Gabe Schoberg over there, who's our natural history partner in programs. This event today is the third and final event about the nighttime. Two events preceded this over at the Natural History Museum, and then we culminate here today. So it's been great fun to partner with those folks in really kind of simply because they are so interdisciplinarily strong. They do history and science and social science, and we've drawn from their expertise all across today. So it's really a wonderful way to partner with our neighbor across the street. So I want to thank the libraries for allowing us to use this space, largely because of our other chief partner, Karen Hubner, back there, who is the, what's your title? Yeah, go ahead. Okay, better you said by you than me. So Karen and I teach a year-long class on LA from every discipline that we can throw at it, which is really fun. And we're doing it right now. And partnering with Karen is always a joy. And Karen is sort of the mayor of this floor of the library. So it's great to be here, thanks to Karen's good graces. And then the Institute on California and the West team, Elizabeth Logan back there, Associate Director, Taryn Hedostian right here, Administrative Director, Jessica Kim, Social Media Director. That's our team that puts forward programs and as many ideas as we can about the history and culture of the modern American West. So thank you to everybody. Did I miss anybody, Elizabeth? I think. What's that? Oh, yes. So Susie Norashat, where are you, Susie? Susie Norashat is our Southern California Libraries specialist, our Southern California specialist here in the libraries and special collections. We work very closely with her in our teaching and our research. And she has very kindly brought along not only imagery like these, but print imagery of LA at Night. She's also brought along Charles Bukowski manuscripts. So please don't have your coffee cup in your hand when you look at those, but by all means take a look. It's really a great flavor of the city at night. Okay, so with that, let me just run through a couple of housekeeping issues. Women's room is right out here, just in the hallway. And then the men's room is down this hallway and all the way down to the left. We will serve you lunch. We've got your breakfast and pastries and bagels there. Please help yourselves throughout the day. And then lunchtime, we're going to bring in a bunch of pizzas, and they'll be over here in this adjacent room over here. So please enjoy yourselves throughout the day. Please introduce yourselves to one another. We're just going to spend a lot of time in the nighttime here through the day and see not a comprehensive look at LA at night, but far more than a sliver as well. So, and then a year from now, we're going to do LA underwater. So come back. We'll be underwater by then, so come back, and we're going to investigate that. So each panel is casual but expert, and we invite you to participate in the Q&A and discussions between sessions with our experts. So please feel more than welcome to interact with the panelists and the ideas that they bring to us. I wanted to begin with a remarkable poem by Gary Snyder, which I'm blanking on the title of it right now. Night Song of the Los Angeles Basin. Thank you. I printed the poem, but not the title. And I just wanted to set the stage a little bit. I was tempted to turn off all the lights, close the doors, and make it really dark in here. Yeah? Okay, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Sorry for the filming. We'll flow them back up in a second. Okay. If we close the doors, though, I won't be able to see my poem. So maybe that's close enough. We're going to set the stage a little bit for the day's work. Is there a light up here, you think? Or make my phone light? If not, it's okay. I can read it. I can see it. I can see it. Okay. Okay. Night Song of the Los Angeles Basin by Gary Snyder. Owl calls, pollen dust blows, swirl of light strokes writhing, knot tying light paths, calligraphy of cars. Los Angeles Basin and hill slopes, checkered with streetways, floral loops of the freeway express and exchange. Dragons of light in the dark, sweep going both ways in the night city belly. The passage of light end to end and rebound, ride drivers all heading somewhere, etch in their traces to night's eye mind. Calligraphy of cars, vole paths, mouse trails worn in on meadow grass, winding pocket gopher tunnels, marmot lookout rocks, houses with green watered gardens slip under the ghost of the dry chaparral. Ghost shrine to the LA River. The Jinja that never was there is there. Where the river debouches, the place of the moment of trembling and gathering and giving, so that lizards clap hands there. Just lizards, come pray, saying, please give us health and long life. A hawk, a mouse, slash of calligraphy of freeway of cars. Into the pools of the channelized river, the goddess in tall rain dress tosses a handful of meal. Gold bellies roll, mouth bubbles, frenzy of feeding, the common ones. The bright-colored rare ones show up. They tangle and tumble. Godlings ride by in Rolls-Royce, wide-eyed in brokers' halls, lifted in hotels being presented to. Platters of tidbit and wine, snatch of fame, churn and roll, meal gone, the water subsides. A mouse, a hawk, the calligraphy of lights on the night freeways of Los Angeles will long be remembered. Owl calls, late rising moon. That's Gary Snyder's poem. Okay, I guess we could have to throw the lights back on. I'm going to turn the podium over to my friend David Ulin, who's going to set us some spoken themes beyond poetry about the noir sensibilities of LA, and then we'll roll into our first panel with Jessica Kim as our moderator. So thanks again for coming. Enjoy the day. Please join me in welcoming David Ulin. Everybody's biography's in here, so we're not going to spend a lot of time telling people who they are. David Ulin is a brilliant writer. Come on up.
It's a perfect photo because that's they shoot horses, don't they? Or sort of, or it could be. Okay. Hi, how are you all? Thanks for coming. I am going to sort of read some stuff and talk some stuff, so I'm just going to clear a little bit of space. I was asked to just sort of riff a little bit on the concept of noir, what it is, how it relates. It is a kind of, I think, a fairly essential LA genre, but I also am interested in kind of how we think of it now as opposed to how it, what its genesis was. So. We can start with I always want to start with a key question. So the key question is, what is it? What is noir? It's one of those catch-all designations, and I know it when I see it concept, as elusive as a Santa Ana wind. It's an American genre with a French name, a literary style perhaps best understood in terms of film, 1940s atmospheric black and white. As a form, it got it started in the 1920s with the writers who contributed to the pulp magazine Black Mask. These included Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, not an LA writer, but Red Harvest, published in 1929. You could make a case perhaps for that as the first hard-boiled novel. There are a couple others, I think, that fit that category. And the now largely forgotten Paul Kane, whose 1933 novel Fast One brought noir to Los Angeles. The 1930s were a golden age of noir. In 1934 and 1935, James M. Cain published back-to-back The Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity, perhaps the two greatest noir novels of all, two of the greatest American novels of the 1930s, certainly. Horace McCoy portrayed murder as an act of compassion in They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which was about a dance marathon, hence that photograph that we just saw. And what these books all share is a sense of the world as lost, desperate, a place where bad things happen, where people are taken advantage of, or worse, take advantage of themselves. By 1939, when Chandler published his first novel, The Big Sleep, noir, although not yet called that, had become part of the popular imagination, an anti-myth evoking darkness and the darkness and desolation that lay beneath the surfaces of American life. Chandler's detective, Philip Marlowe, is the ultimate free agent, a man with his own moral code who must nonetheless act in ways that don't always sit well, to do right by people who are themselves not right and good. Corruption drips from the book, beginning from The Big Sleep, beginning with the first chapter when Marlowe visits the Sternwood mansion, reportedly based on Greystone, the Beverly Hills estate, where on February 16th, 1929, Ned Doheny, the namesake of this building, died in a murder-suicide. And one of my favorite LA proto-noir stories. So Marlowe meets Carmen Sternwood, quote, 20 or so, small and delicately put together, with little sharp predatory teeth as white as fresh orange pith and as shiny as porcelain. If Carmen is one kind of trouble, her father, General Sternwood, is another, old and sickly, a literal hothouse flower condemned to a sweltering greenhouse full of orchids, a forest of them, with nasty, meaty leaves and stalks, a forest of them with nasty, meaty leaves and stalks that lie like the newly washed fingers of dead men. The smell they smelled as overpowering as boiling alcohol under a blanket. In just a few pages, Chandler sets the stage for his entire body of work, framing the city as an artificial jungle populated by feral children and rich men rotting in the heat. His is a vision that lingers, infusing everything from Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays to Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero to the terrible beauty of the Getty fire. What did it matter where you lay once you were dead, Chandler writes, in a dirty sump or in a marble tower on top of a high hill? You were dead. You were sleeping the big sleep. You were not bothered by things like that. Oil and water were the same as wind and air to you. You just slept the big sleep, not caring about the nastiness of how you died or where you fell. Me, I was part of that nastiness now. That nastiness, as Chandler puts it, or more to the point, how we choose to deal with it, is a defining feature of contemporary life, and it casts Los Angeles as a contemporary city or creation above all. In many ways, noir was a reaction to the Depression, which marks the early work in the genre like a brand. It was a treacherous time, a time in which stories shifted and the promises were not kept. Gangsters became folk heroes, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde. Edward Anderson's 1937 novel Thieves Like Us takes on this type of figure, a bank robber who pursues crime reluctantly, even as his outlaw legend grows. In You Play the Black and the Red Comes Up, terrific title, Eric Knight, better known as the author of the children's classic Lassie Come Home, put another spin on the era, describing a man who follows his wayward wife to California, only to fall into an empty peripatetic life. Knight, at the beginning of the novel, Knight writes, there was a bunch of floaters. This takes place in a boxcar on its way from the Dust Bowl to California. There was a bunch of floaters inside who were all heading for California because there was a man there going to be elected governor who would take all the money from the millionaires and give $50 a week to every man without a job. It's good social policy and nothing if not reminiscent of the times in which we are currently operating. At the same time, there's something about Los Angeles that is particular to noir. It is a national and an international genre, but there's something about Los Angeles in this territory, and particularly Los Angeles in the late 1930s. I want to make a brief case for 1939 as the annus mirabilis of Los Angeles culture, and certainly of Los Angeles literary life, or literary culture. This is because three key novels, all with touches of noir, were published almost simultaneously over the course of that year. The three novels are The Big Sleep, which we've been chatting about a little bit, The Day of the Locust, Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust, and John Fonte's Ask the Dust. I actually consider this to be the first great trilogy of Los Angeles literature, even though there's no evidence that these writers ever knew each other. They did sort of all float through Hollywood at various points, but there are some really interesting parallels and overlaps in their books. I'm not suggesting, parenthetically, that these three novels are the first Los Angeles novels. That I still think would probably be Helen Hunt Jackson's 1884 pastoral Ramona, which in sentimentalizing the ranchos created another predominant Southern California myth, or even the first modern novels of LA, right? We talked about Kane, so there's Double Indemnity. Even earlier than that, in 1930, Carroll and Garrett Graham published Queer People, a Hollywood satire so scathing, Bud Schulberg once wrote, quote, "You would not dare to bring it into a motion picture studio unless you hid it in brown paper and locked it in your middle desk drawer." Yet for all the power of those books, they are precursors, because 1939 to me is where Los Angeles grows up. We're not just talking about the books, but in terms of the cultural context, 1939 was the year the Depression ended. It was the year Europe exploded into World War II. It was the year of the New York World's Fair, the year much of the work was done on the Arroyo Parkway, the first freeway in the United States. It was the year of Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, of Technicolor and The Grapes of Wrath. It was a year, in other words, of hope and fear and self-awareness, and the literature reflects this. The ineluctable push and pull between opportunity and crisis, between the utopian and the dystopian. What's interesting to me about this is that it offers a sense of context in a city that is widely regarded as context-free. It offers a starting point, or even we might call it a frame. And I think partly this is really important in terms of the way we think about Los Angeles as a literary culture, a literary landscape. It's generally, as we all know, kind of overlooked as a literary landscape, partly, I think, as a result of its overriding visual filter, the kind of preeminence of film and painting, visual art, the influence of space and light. Literature is more, let's say, an art of the night, of the dark spaces, not necessarily of the light. I was amazed at the size of the city and at its lack of shape, Christopher Isherwood wrote in May 1939 entry in his diaries. There seemed no reason why it should ever stop. Miles and miles of little houses, wooden or stucco, under a Technicolor sky. But even more, I think the issue is that these houses, this sprawl, undercuts the notion of narrative itself. We see this emerge in particularly, or most overtly, I think, of those 1939 novels in Fonte's novel and West's novel, which talk about the break, in partly the break of narrative in people who move here from elsewhere and don't find what they're looking for. Excuse me. Where else should they go but California, the land of sunshines and oranges, West writes at the end of The Day of the Locust. Once there, they discover that sunshine isn't enough. They get tired of oranges, even of avocado pears and passion fruit. Nothing happens. They don't know what to do with their time. Uncannily, Ask the Dusk echoes these sentiments almost exactly, even down to the language. Here's a quote from Ask the Dust. From Fonte. Dust and old buildings and old people sitting at windows, old people tottering out of doors, old people moving painfully along the dark streets, the old folk from Indiana and Iowa and Illinois, from Boston and Kansas City and Des Moines. They sold their homes and their stores, and they came here by train and by automobile to the land of sunshine to die in the sun with just enough money to live until the sun killed them, tore themselves out by the roots in their last days, deserted the smug prosperity of Kansas City and Chicago and Peoria to find a place in the sun. If that's not noir, I don't know what is. I also want to point out, just as another example of noir, Fonte begins that novel with a line that could easily come out of Chandler or any of the other noir writers we're talking about. Just give me 1 second while I find it here. Sorry, I thought I was more organized than I was, but I guess I'm not. Well, I'll find it when I get there. Oh, here it is. One night I was sitting on the bed in my hotel. This is the first sentence of the novel, or the first sentences of the novel. One night I was sitting on the bed in my hotel room on Bunker Hill down in the very middle of Los Angeles. It was an important night in my life because I had to make a decision about the hotel. Either I paid up or I got out. That was what the note said, the note the landlady had put under my door. A great problem deserving acute attention. I solved it by turning out the lights and going to bed. Okay, so I think, those books, as I say, they're not, they may appear as kind of noirish anomalies, but I don't think of them as such. I think of them as really defining a kind of sensibility. And one of the things I've long thought is that that in terms of that sensibility, it must say something about what Los Angeles was like at that time. For three novels to, as E.M. Forster once said, we read fiction for the buzz of implication. It tells us what it's like to live in a moment. We may not tell us all the facts we need, but it gives us the emotional sense of what it's like to live in a specific time and place. If you want to learn about Victorian London, read Dickens. If you want to learn about Tsarist St. Petersburg, read Gogol. And I think that in some ways these three novels operate in this kind of territory. It seems to me that for three writers working in the same place at the same time in parallel, not necessarily in conjunction with one another, all three to hit on a similar kind of sort of no-nonsense noirist sensibility suggests that Los Angeles in the 1930s was a place where that was a kind of a prevailing point of view or a prevailing way of living. And yet, I think that one of the things one of the other things I want to just touch on, so one thing is I think it defines Los Angeles. I think that the Los Angeles component of this has been defined by Mike Davis in City of Quartz as the sunshine noir dialectic. The idea that people come to California, whether to escape or to reinvent themselves, they come for the sunshine in some sense. And when they get here, and they don't get what they want, there's really nowhere else to go. So the flip side of aspiration, the flip side of this notion of sunshine is a kind of despair or desperation, and both of those two things kind of sit in suspension together. I think this is still a fairly accurate way of looking at the place, but I also think that in contemporary Southern California, it's too simple. Because one of the things that sunshine noir dialectic assumes is that people is a transplant culture, people coming from elsewhere, coming here to get away from their past, coming here to activate some kind of dream or fantasy of what they think they want to be doing, and having to deal with the fallout or the failure of it. What's interesting is that that's only one story of California, and that's particularly a story of people coming from the east. Land's End is only Land's End if you're coming east to west. If you're coming west to east, for instance, it's Land's Beginning. If you're coming north to south, it's just another way station on the road. Richard Rodriguez writes in his essay Late Victorians, talking about San Francisco, but the point applies. To speak of San Francisco as Land's End is to read the map from one direction only, as Europeans would read it, or as the East Coast has always read it. To speak, therefore, of San Francisco as Land's End is to betray parochialism. My parents came here from Mexico. They saw San Francisco as the North. The West was not West for them. They did not share the Eastern traveler's sense of running before the last, the darkening time zone, the lowering curtain. And I think that that's really important for us also as we think about contemporary noir. One of the things that noir has always functioned as is a kind of social document. If we think about the Los Angeles, again, that Chandler is writing about, he's giving us a vision of Los Angeles in that period. It's a highly stylized vision of the city. A friend of mine once compared it to kabuki theater in terms of its kind of rigid rules and aesthetics, but it is a vision of that city. And as we move further into sort of what we call contemporary noir or neo-noir, we really start to see the city through the social lens of the writing. If you look at, say, Walter Mosley and the E.Z. Rollins books, which start in the 40s and move into the 1960s, those books are both detective novels and a kind of social history or series of social novels about the life of the city. If you look at a writer like Steph Cha, contemporary noir writer in Los Angeles, whose new novel is essentially a reimagining of the aftermath of the Rodney King riots. You look at Naomi Hirahara, who has written a number of excellent mysteries, but in a series wrapped around a fictional rookie cop in Los Angeles named Ellie Rush. The first book, Murder on Bamboo Lane, was the first novel I have read in Los Angeles when it came out about I think 2013, that really captured the city as it is now, with characters who ride the metro and hang out, in downtown LA, and and live in Highland Park and all over the city. And so there's something about the way, or Nina Revoir, for instance, another writer who is both a kind of again, I think like West and Fonte is a writer who adapts noir sensibility towards what we might call literary fiction, although I think those distinctions are pretty useless, generally speaking. All fiction is literary or not on its own terms. But applying that in terms of looking at the city's history of race and class. What this suggests to me is that noir is eminently and sort of infinitely flexible and and ultimately quite open to our interpretation and to our influence. I think it's important to think about it in terms of its expansive sensibility, how the form changes or adapts to the culture, or as the culture changes and adapts. I think it's important not to think of it as locked into a kind of 1930s hard-boiled vision. But it's also important to remember that although that sort of hard-boiled detective in the trench coat with the hat, the Philip Marlowe stereotype, has become a kind of a cliche, when it was created, it was groundbreaking and original. So I'm really interested in how that sort of original impulse, which again is speaking to a sort of desperation in the place, but a desperation in the times of the 1930s, can move through a variety of iterations to reflect the times and the place we live in. Certainly we are living in a time as desperate in its way as the 1930s, and ripe for noir, and we see noir everywhere, right? In some ways, if you're watching the hearings, what you're watching is a kind of really tawdry noir story on the grand scale. As a friend of mine who's a crime writer has continually said about these guys, I wish they were better criminals. I wish the narrative were more interesting. But what it tells us is that these kinds of issues are core human issues, and noir it addresses that notion and peels back the surface. Okay, that's what I've got. That's our stage setter. Thank you. And we'll bring up the first panel and get started.
Make sure we got all our panelists here. Bryan, Daniel. Great, perfect. Come on, guys. Yeah. So Jessica Kim from Cal State Northridge is our moderator for this panel.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for joining us and for fighting the traffic to get here. We are beginning today by considering Los Angeles through night skies, and we're shifting a bit from David's talk on noir to think about Los Angeles at night, but through the lens of science. And as Bill mentioned, everybody's full biographies are in the program, so I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, and then we'll move into their presentations, and then we'll reserve some time at the end for questions and discussion with all of you. So we are going to think about LA from everything from archaeoastronomy, which I had to practice saying this morning, night plants, and even winged creatures after dark. And joining us, we have Bryan Penprase. He's the Dean of Faculty and Undergraduate Programs at Soka University of America. Then we have Jim Folsom, who's Curator of the Botanical Gardens at the Huntington, and who I have to note lives at the Huntington, which... But I mean, is there any more amazing place to live in Southern California? I don't think so. And then finally, Daniel Cooper joins us from UCLA, the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, to discuss birds at night. So please join me in welcoming them, and then we'll start with Bryan.
there I am younger. That was me 8 years ago in Chile, my little picture. My students have to check to see if that's actually me. And here's my talk. All right, and all right. Yeah, that's a famous woodcut that sort of depicts this vision of the world beyond. And as an astronomer, I think that's sort of indicative of how some of us kind of think about the world. We're always looking up and trying to peer beyond the LA sky, which often prevents us from seeing anything but helicopters and light pollution from that calligraphy of cars that was mentioned earlier. I think all of us may think about LA at night and in terms of the lights of the city, in terms of cars, in terms of detective stories, in terms of the Noir literature that we heard about. And I'm going to just shift a little bit to talk about that part of LA's night scene that in many ways has defined our civilization's awareness of our larger place in the universe. That, of course, being astronomy. And we should remember that Los Angeles was the birthplace of the Big Bang cosmology, of Mount Wilson, of Palomar, of discoveries about how the universe was formed, where we came from, Jet Propulsion Lab with exploration missions across the solar system. And even before that, our ancient ancestors, Native Americans here, were also seekers. They weren't recent transplants. In most cases, the tribes here who arrived thousands of years ago knew they had a good thing when they saw it. So some of the tribes in this region, such as the Chumash tribe near Ventura, are some of the oldest and most continuous people in all of North America, having first arrived here in this beautiful part of the world 12,000 years ago. And so we have long roots into looking up. And the ancient Chumash and also the Tongva tribes, who are from sort of the San Gabriel Valley region, were all active astronomers. So I think it's important to kind of reclaim that part of our culture and our heritage when we think of LA after dark. In my work, I have what you might call a day job. I'm a dean of faculty. And then I have a night job. I'm an astronomer. Now, I wasn't always in that configuration. I spent 20 years at Pomona College managing a little observatory called Brackett Observatory. I worked at Caltech with astronomers. I've been on several research projects. I've done a lot of things with astronomy, both in terms of pushing the boundaries of how we know how first stars formed, and also how ancient people interpreted the skies. And I want to also just mention in my new job, in my new position, I've managed to build a little observatory, which is called the Nieves Observatory, after our generous donor who made it possible. And my institution, Soka University of America, is technically not part of LA, but like a lot of LA, it's one of those far-flung edges of the LA region, which I have trouble explaining to visitors what LA actually is. And especially Northern Californians who look condescendingly at LA and say, there's no center, there's no culture here. And I say, well, that's what makes it so beautiful. It is something that as soon as you discover something in one corner of LA, there's another corner of LA that's either been built or has changed beyond recognition. And so it's unknowable. And in so many ways, it's like the universe itself. It requires metaphors of what in our business we call light cones. That is, you as an observer in the universe can only see things out at things that are dictated by the speed of light. So every time you look far away, you're looking back in time, and you're confined to a light cone. You can't see what that galaxy looks like now. It's impossible, because it's so far away, millions of light years away. You're seeing it as it was millions of years ago. Now, I know any of you who've driven in Los Angeles also know that it takes millions of years sometimes to get to that other part of LA. So in a sense, we're also confined not so much to a light cone, but to a freeway cone, that we sit inside our little sort of bubbles of glass and steel. And our knowledge, it comes from kind of a stream of consciousness of audio, visual inputs, and whatever places we're able to visit and place ourselves in within this giant region of Los Angeles. So another metaphor I use for visitors, for Northern Californians, about LA, is it's also something like a brain. It's something like a neural net. And each cell is connected to other cells, but not to the entire brain. In a brain, a human brain has 100 billion cells, about the same as the number of stars in our Milky Way galaxy. Each one of them is connected to thousands of others. But each cell is not the entire thing. It's the collective of all those cells and interconnections that determines who you are, who your mind is. And I sort of think Los Angeles is something like that as well. Anyway, to my point. I'm talking about archaeoastronomy today. And I want to just sort of broaden it a little bit, just to remind everyone of our experience of the night sky. And as an astronomer, I go out to a telescope. I sit there, and I watch the skies slowly darken. So even that experience of night falling is something that we, as modern people, tend to lose. Earlier today, we turned off the lights to create a simulation of darkness. But that's not night. Night is the entire sky changing color, changing its aspect, deepening from sort of a pale gray into a bluish purple, into a blackish orangey thing, depending on which part of LA you're in. And that experience of time, temporality, is an important part of how ancient people experience the sky and how astronomers also experience the sky. Everything takes a long time in astronomy. As I mentioned, the galaxy's light takes millions of years to get to us. Night falls in its own pace, taking hours. Stars wheel ahead over many hours. Our telescopes can capture what's going on out there, but it takes hours sometimes for those tiny little photons who are trickling in from millions of light years away to collect on our sensors. And then from that, we can actually get the first ever glimpse of distant areas in the universe. Now, my little observatory, which is located somewhere near Irvine, we're in Aliso Viejo, which is off of the 73, another very LA thing. You just take 405 and then go to 73, and that astounds visitors as well, that we can recount all these freeway numbers. But I'm in what we call the urban-rural, urban-wild interface, the one that always burns. And what's interesting about it is not just the fact that our plants burn on a regular cycle, but that it has all this nature right there. And as an astronomer, you see it coming out. So at my little observatory, I've watched as night has settled in various animals. Here we see a deer greet you. Sometimes the animals that greet you, you don't want to be greeted by. That would include a couple of raccoons who are anything but cute, sort of guarding my observatory and preventing me from coming near. We've seen owls, and we'll hear more about that later. Other interesting creatures bouncing around in the night. Anyway, so this is our observatory. By the way, I also have a book, Power of Stars on Archaeoastronomy. If you're interested, makes a great Christmas present. Available on Amazon. Okay, enough for a plug. Now, getting to archaeoastronomy. So archaeoastronomy is the way ancient people organized their conception of how the sky and themselves were connected. And it's a whole range of ways of celebrating the night sky, or observing the night sky, or synchronizing their civilization with the night sky, and day sky as well. Now, we people who have limited astronomy knowledge, almost anyone, if you poll them, will have one constellation they can identify, right? That one, Big Dipper. Now, the Big Dipper is a good place to locate ourselves just to get started on this, because if you look at the Big Dipper, it's a set of stars which every ancient culture in the Northern Hemisphere has looked at. And for example, the Chinese saw in each one of those stars a different minister in their imperial government. And since today is actually the day for USC prospective students, I might point out that one of these stars here, the star here, which the Arabic astronomers called Aliak, is the Minister for Student Welfare. We also have the sort of the humanities department over here. And then this one I really like for the admissions department. This is kind of the one that would allow you to get into the civil service. So that's their equivalent of the admissions office. Now, the ancient Chinese saw in the sky kind of a mirroring of the imperial city in Beijing, and the northernmost point of the imperial city had the same kind of structure as they put in their star maps, and different bureaus were actually arranged inside the imperial city to mirror the sky as the ancient Chinese saw it. Similarly, for other people, the same group of stars was part of a navigational system. So for the ancient Polynesians and the Hawaiians, we see the Big Dipper as just one of many of these stars that they can be used to navigate across the Pacific Ocean. And I actually mentioned both of these people for a reason, because they're part of our civilization. They are our heritage here. The Polynesians, the Hawaiians contributed to the building of 19th century California in really interesting ways. You can read about it in Dana's book. Of course, Chinese are a huge component of our society, Chinese Americans. And so it's important to also celebrate their heritage when we think about the sky and their earlier traditions toward the sky. This is also another figure showing how stars played a role in Polynesian wayfaring. Now, we can make maps of the sky that will kind of be similar to what Western star maps might be, and for different cultures, different characters appeared on the night sky. So if you think of it, and we'll maybe use an very LA metaphor, almost like a cinema, we can put different characters into this sky, depending on who is looking at it. So in this case, we're looking at a map that shows how the Navajo would see the sky. And the Big Dipper is part of a constellation that includes a pair, what amounts to first man and first woman, who are involved in the creation of their world. The Great Spirit created the universe and put first man and first woman, something of an Adam and Eve on the planet. And they are now commemorated in the sky, revolving endlessly around the pole star. And they can celebrate that heritage every time they look up at the sky. If you go farther north, up into sort of Arctic regions, you'll see in the Big Dipper a caribou and other sort of very Arctic kinds of things. For the Chumash, in the tribe that I mentioned near Ventura, Santa Barbara, the Big Dipper takes the form of boys who turned into geese. And it's sort of a parable of rebellious youth who go astray and dabble in the dark arts. And they are actually transformed, they grow feathers and float up into the sky. And it's used as a cautionary tale for young people. All around the Southwest, you can see star maps. These are Navajo star maps, both from secret kinds of caves and from sand paintings that depict characters. Ancient Egyptians also did this, showing all the different characters from their sky. In case you're interested, this is the Big Dipper here, which I think is the most imaginative portrayal of the Big Dipper, as a hippopotamus with an alligator on its back, taking a cow for a walk. I think that wins a prize for originality. In the Chumash case, they had also these wonderful star caves, and they were places where shamans would retreat to and perform a week or more of visions and of watching very carefully the aspect of the stars in the night sky as a way of reconciling the society's calendars. They went off by themselves. They often took hallucinogenic drugs that assisted them in their visions. And then they would bring that back to a group of elites who then together would take the same hallucinogenic drugs. I think you can see some mirroring of that in current LA society, perhaps. I don't know. But this was actually very instrumental for their ability to interpret what the universe was doing. And this particular drug that they took was called datura, and it was derived from a local plant. And it was actually part of their religious ritual that sort of blended astronomy and visions. These are astronomical symbols that were painted in a cave somewhere near Santa Barbara. Many of these locations are secret, all of them threatened by fire regularly. And all of them have these kind of abstract, semi-human kinds of figures who also depict shamanic people who often transform into other creatures, and also some more abstract ideas that are hard to interpret, but of course archaeoastronomers see astronomical patterns. Another big part of archaeoastronomy is the location on the horizon of the sun. And this changes throughout the year, so the sun will rise in different positions depending on the season, sort of swinging back and forth with an annual cycle. And so lots of ancient civilizations would note this, Stonehenge being one of the most famous. Around Great Britain are other sites that are aligned with winter or summer solstice. In our area, and southwest, more generally, there are various fixed structures that align with the solstice. So this one is called Hovenweep. It's in New Mexico, and it has a little slit that emits a light on the summer solstice that cuts through sun figures. There's also a famous place in Colorado called Chimney Rock, where a little slot in these two rocks aligns with a kiva where people could watch the lunar standstill point, which only happens once every 18 years. Very mysterious. There's a picture from that viewpoint. In our region, there's a place that is called, sometimes called Winter Solstice Cave, Burrow Flat. It's in the Santa Susana test range, which is a part of an old Rocketdyne facility. Famous actually for its toxic waste, because there was a sodium nuclear reactor that was built there that spilled a bunch of radioactive waste. I mention this because it's an interesting juxtaposition of ancient and modern spacefaring, if you will. It was not only the site of modern day space program development, but it was a site of ancient people who used this cave as a way of finding the winter solstice. And what they would do is they would watch very carefully as a sliver of light would enter into the cave and slice through a little sun figure there. And this only happens once a year, and it would be coincide with other rituals that they would do to reconcile their calendar. They would, in that ritual, celebrate the sun, and actually as a group, collectively stop the sun from setting. So this goes back to the theme of people in Southern California finding the sun, kind of worshiping the sun. Ancient Native Americans recognized the sun and that precarious balance between life and death, death being from too much sun. And so one of the figures in their pantheon in the sky, Sun, is considered kind of an evil, grouchy old man who eats small children who don't listen to their parents. Again, another cautionary tale. Whereas Coyote is thought in their sky people to be that mediator for humans who tries to bring about a more mild and more just behavior of the sun. And as a group, they would align with their local shaman using a sun staff. And every year near the winter solstice, they would have a very carefully prescribed dance where women would go in one counterclockwise direction, men in a clockwise direction, timed perfectly for the winter solstice to stop the sun from sinking farther and farther south and disappearing. And every year it worked. The sun came back. One of my friends, Ed Krupp, who directs the Griffith Observatory, leads tours occasionally to the site, and he pointed out in one of our visits that there's also a summer solstice site, which is really interesting. And this is a site where a little notch up in the cliff is lit up as the sun rises on the summer solstice, and it casts a little beam of light down into this, what looks like a little inconspicuous set of holes drilled into the rock. But right above it is this really interesting rock that's very painstakingly decorated with these little cupules, these little holes. And as the summer solstice sun rises over that notch, it casts a little notch of light onto this big rock. And then down below, a sliver of shadow crosses through those little holes. Really amazing to see. And it has sort of an Indiana Jones type feel to see these things happening in real time. It all happens very slowly, very gradually, very majestically, and continues over thousands and thousands of years. Even centuries from now, this will still happen in this site. There's Ed. So this is their universe, a 3-level universe. Again, in very LA style, it's supported on the backs of snakes, the underworld. The snakes, when they wriggle, create earthquakes. So they built in our seismic activity into it. And on the upper level, the sky people play their game called Peon, on which the fate of the humans below depended, with Sun, again, that grouchy man, crossing a tether across the sky every day and looking for children to pluck and put into his headband. They would feed to his ravenous daughters who lived in an ice cave along with Moon. They have a wonderful story of how the first people were led from the Channel Islands offshore across a rainbow bridge and then populated the mainland. That migration came about because it was too crowded and the people were getting noisy and it was disturbing Hutash, the earth goddess. So she created the rainbow bridge to lead them across. Most of them made it, but some fell in. And those people that fell in became dolphins, and they also became swordfish. And those two creatures would help people to this day because they have that kinship with them. Here's another representation of that. The names of these worlds in Chumash, a language that's lost to most, but being reconstructed by hardworking volunteers. And finally, I'll just wind up and thank all of you for your attention and look forward to more questions and comments. And if you want more information about our observatory, there's our site, and then that's my email. Thank you.
This is my toy, my prize.
Use this if
Okay,
you
great.
want. Or...
Thanks very much. So I'm going to bring you back to Earth for just a few minutes and walk you quickly through some thoughts I've had when Bill mentioned this. He said, what do plants do at night? And I said, well, what don't they do at night? They're pretty busy. And I was trying to think about Los Angeles and my plants and my garden and what I try to tell people. And so I just decided that I would go back to my childhood. I grew up in an era of non-cable TV, and the main programs that weren't news were the soap operas. I don't know if you remember The Edge of Night and As the World Turns. So, so when I think about night in plants, I don't think about night. Plants don't understand night. They don't understand anything. Plants experience light and dark. And we as botanists use terms, entomologists, crepuscular. We always think of crepuscular as being things that start happening in twilight. It's a lovely word, but it's been sort of replaced by the word scotobiology. So if we think scotobiologically, what are plants in darkness? What's going on? One thing to start off with is the fact that for plants, darkness is the norm, sort of. I mean, reverse your life for a minute and don't think of light as being your norm. Think of darkness as being the norm and light being this brilliant, interesting interval that happens once in a while. Because much of a plant might live in total darkness all the time. Roots, for example. So what are roots busy doing? They're busy growing and living too. They have a life. We, in biological terms, call it respiration. They're busy respiring. And that's not like just breathing in and breathing out, but it's related in that respiration to biologists is taking energy-rich compounds like sugars and breaking them down by using oxygen, oxidizing them, capturing the energy to do things, to keep life going. Life is a battle against entropy, so you have to keep moving. And you have to keep either growing or at least keep all your processes going. So roots are busy doing that. So are shoots, leaves and stems and flowers are busy respiring too. It's just that in the daytime, those parts of plants have an offsetting balance. They continue taking in oxygen, but they're producing oxygen at a higher rate. When I was a kid, there was a residual thought in some small towns. I grew up in a small town, left over from hundreds of years before when Ingenhouse first studied plants and started suggesting that maybe at night you should not have plants in hospital rooms or in houses because plants are net users of oxygen at night. I don't know if you recall, if you're older like me, then there was a time when people actually talked about taking plants out of hospital rooms at night. They might actually impact the quality of the atmosphere. That's of course all bullshit. But it was a thought, and it was based on a reality. And the reality is that plants do are net users of oxygen at night, and roots are always net users because they live in darkness. The poster child of plants at night, of course, would be plants that flower and are pollinated at night, and probably you've all heard about that. So I'm going to scan through that just because I want you to know that I know about that too. So Brugmansia is fragrant. I've got one in my drive in it, and we once in a while bother to water it specifically to flush out a new course of flowering, and at night it's got a kind of a sweet, peculiar odor that's kind of pleasant when you come in the drive. So these long, we think of long tubular plants like Nicotiana. This is, wait now, let's see. Is that the pointer? Oh, that's the backer. The pointer is, what points? Oh, there's not a pointer. Okay, so the picture on the left is just a stand of a Nicotiana. That's the tobacco there. Yeah, okay. Well, anyway, the picture on the left is the, oh, I usually pack one also, but I didn't bring it. Yeah, thank you very much. So is Nicotiana, that's in our herb garden. Long tubular white flowers, fragrant at night. It's called a syndrome. Jasmines, the many different jasmines, fragrant at night, planted all around Los Angeles. Some people are overwhelmed. Some people don't even like the smell of some of them. The Trichelospermum star jasmine exists in bunkers all over the place, just huge displays of it, and sometimes overwhelming, like with that cold cream cosmetic smell. Orange flowers look to be night pollinated with their white and their fragrance, but I haven't found any evidence that they are. So sometimes masquerading in the syndrome of night pollinated plants are plants that actually use bees and everybody else. And this is a gorgeous tropical. We grow, the flower goes from here to here, and that's like an 8-inch thing. And this would only be pollinated by a hovering moth at night or in the crepuscular hours in the evening. A lot of cacti, a lot of plants that all around you are night opening and night pollinated. This was outside our gate just last week. We don't plant these for the neighbors, but they're the only ones who enjoy them because they just hang out in the trees all around. The most famous case of night pollination is one that we grow, but it's not like something you're going to run into on the streets of LA. It's Angricum sesquipedale. It's famous because Darwin, who wrote the first book on orchid pollination, studied the nectaries of this plant and from Madagascar and said, well, clearly somewhere there is a moth with a proboscis that's 1.5 feet long, and it's somewhere in Madagascar because there would be no other reason for this orchid to have this structure. And indeed, 30 years later, a moth was found with a 1.5 foot long proboscis. So it's kind of fun because it's a case of a genius. I mean, Darwin was certainly a genius, but with a practical bent, predicting the existence of an organism based on his understanding of biology, and then that prediction being proven out. So it's kind of fun. You don't just have to have moths, you can have bats. This is a plant that we grow. It does better in the humid, warm nights of South Florida, but it's from Africa, Cagelia africana, and it's bat pollinated. Great big flower. The bat lands here at night and laps up the nectar and carries the pollen. So these are the poster children of nighttime activity of plants, but that's not really the most important thing about plants and darkness. So borrowing from our previous speaker for just a second, there is a sun, and the earth is spinning around it and rotating and doing all these things that are very complex and hard to keep track of. The further you go from the equator to the north or the south, the more seasonal impact that has on you. And plants are actually pretty good at keeping track of that. So plants live in this world in which the differential between daylight and darkness allows them to predict life ahead, evolutionarily predict it. I mean, if you did wrong, you don't hang around, and if you did right, you hang around to reproduce, and there you have it. So this is Los Angeles 2019 sun graph. So you're looking at relative, I put today on there, so that's today. You're looking at relative darkness and sunlight, and you're looking at wonderful terms that you can explain to us better than I can. The different ways of perceiving the change in night, nautical, twilight, daylight, night, finally. What's fun about this is, or what's interesting to a plant person, is that though plants use that relative, difference between dark and light, which changes seasonally, have adapted to use that in many chemical ways to predict what's going to happen, to predict the need for dormancy, to predict oncoming cold weather, to predict leaves fall, to do many different things. That's getting kind of messed up a bit, not a lot, but a bit for plants, because we live in one of those many hot spots where from the sky we have so much light pollution around us that if you drive down the street, you'll see jacaranda, for example, this winter. Drive around, you'll see that the branches of jacaranda around streetlights still have their leaves, and the branches further from the streetlights have lost their leaves, telling you, reminding you that darkness and the oncoming increase in the percentage of darkness versus lightness is a cue for this plant to go ahead and do everything it has to do to get rid of its leaves. It has to export the nitrogen, because that's kind of a useful chemical you don't want to lose. And then it has to export other certain things, and then it has to build a corky layer between the leaf base and the stem so the leaf can gently fall off. So all of that happens or doesn't happen in an urban setting. So there's a day length thing, but we shouldn't forget that for plants, day length is also totally 100% related to temperature. And the cues for plants are all highly complex, and it might not just be day length, and it might not just be temperature. It might be some combination of the two changing throughout the year. And of course, that's very local. So here we have a yearly roundup, the last year, of max min temps for downtown. Actually, this is for the USC campus daily. So someone here's taking it and somebody else is aggregating it, this guy, climatestation.com. That's a really neat website, okay? And you're seeing that our daily variation in temperature is pretty extreme, like 20 degrees. If you ever lived in South Florida, that is not the truth in South Florida. So here we have, now let's look at another one. So this is from 1921 through to 2008, and it's pretty consistent. You'll see in another graph that the differential day to night is a little bit more in the summer than it is in the winter. Starting about June, it increases. But you're seeing this, several incredible things here. The peak warm, peak cold, reminding ourselves that Los Angeles is basically frost-free downtown, which if we had water, you'd be a wonderful cloud forest, okay? I said that wonderful because I love cloud forests. But, so something's going on with the temperature. I want to show you another graph. And this is another thing that's changing in our urban environment. So it gets colder at nights, it gets warmer in the daytime, of course. But the average temperature is changing. Here's 1920. And so the average over this whole time span is this 65-degree average. But look at what's happened since 1920 to 2020. So the Los Angeles is warming up. That means that the plants that are native here are experiencing a new climate. Now, is that global warming or is that growth in downtown infrastructure and concrete? It's probably a combination, right? But that's kind of interesting that plants that are native here now live in a new world. They live in a world that's more light, and they live in a world that has a different temperature regimen. Just to look at this for a second. So here we're seeing that fluctuation in temperature again. Now, that's important clue to plants too. Cymbidiums, the reason we grow cymbidiums in Southern California and they don't grow cymbidiums in Florida is that cymbidiums set their flower buds in the summer, and they require a 20-degree drop in temperature overnight to get a cue, because they're from a region that does that. So in Florida, there's no such thing in the summer as a 20. If you went and sat out on your patio and it's 93 degrees at 8 o'clock in the evening in Florida, you could stay resting there and wake up your eyes 4 hours later and it would be 90 degrees. You know, the differential is very small. But in California, because we're on the West Coast with our Pacific currents, we experience nearly a 20-degree drop in temperature daily, overnight. And that changes things. It makes for a different world for plants and a different set of cues. So here's another graph to look at that kind of looks like that, except this is a totally different piece of information. So these folks study the water coming through the rocks in the Arroyo Seco. And this is water flow, water productivity down the Arroyo Seco. And this is last week. And the day starts at midnight, and it comes up. And so that's one day, November the 6th through November the 13th. And so the water peaks. It starts out slow in the morning. I'm sorry. I'm doing this. Is so I have to be really careful not to get this reversed. So you see a peak overnight. It's recovering. And then as the day wears on, it drops to nearly zero. And then it recovers again at night. And it does that daily. And you might think, oh, well, so it's getting hot in the daytime, it's changing something about it, water's evaporating. No, this is probably almost purely the fact that the plants that are lining the trees, lining the Arroyo Seco in the daytime are busy transpiring water. So they're doing so much transpiration that they have this daily impact on the flow of water in the Arroyo Seco. So that's another thing. So plants are transpiring water in the daytime and not at night. So at night, the reason they're doing that is because we get to the thing I'd like to spend another couple of minutes on. We get to the fact that plants breathe, and plants have an exchange with the atmosphere. And they do it through these incredibly interesting pairs of cells called guard cells, which form an opening called a stoma, or a mouth. And in pluralizing that, we get to the word stomata. So these are stomata. And they really are sort of an expression of the inside of the plant at the surface. This is epidermal tissue. And the epidermis of a plant is completely covered with waxes and materials that keep the plant from losing water through evaporation and from exchanging information or gases with the atmosphere. All of that's regulated through these wonderful little paired cells called stomata that are highly controlled. This has been around for a long time. Stomata existed in plants 400 million years ago. So plants have had a lot of time to make stomata work right. And they are so complex that no one really understands what regulates them. But we know one thing: in general, they're closed at night and they're open in the daytime. In general, okay? But about 10% or less of the plants around you are obverse. They're different. There's such a thing as crassulacean acid metabolism. We call it CAM. And this review article says working the night shift. So as you walk down the street, there are plants around you that do things different. And we've known that, we've understood it for a while, but we didn't understand why. Those plants actually accumulate carbon dioxide at night, and it gives the plant tissue an acidic, a taste difference. And so people used to note that plants tasted differently. Some plants tasted differently, and in the morning they were acidic, and in the afternoon they were sweet, and that was just kind of a curiosity. And so now we know more about that. Chem photosynthesis, plants living in the shadows of humanity, most people recognizing their unique daily activities. So just some of the plants around you, sedums, there are probably 7,000 orchids in the world that are facultatively CAM, but cacti, bromeliads, pineapples are CAM. Why would you be CAM? What's going on here? CAM plants occur mainly in places where getting water or maintaining a water balance is difficult. Deserts or epiphytes up in trees like orchids. And what CAM plants do is they reverse the whole circumstance. So most plants open their stomata in the daytime while there's light, take in carbon dioxide, which, as you know, is being converted into glucose, is being made into sugars through the power of sunlight. Okay, so most plants are doing this, but it's a trade-off, because when they open their stomata, then they lose a lot of water. Like gallons, a tree will lose 13 or 20 gallons an hour of water. Fine if you've got water, but if the water's not readily available, that's a problem. So a circumstance has evolved from other pre-existing reactions, and these plants close their stomata tightly in the daytime, and they open them at night. Totally the opposite from all the others. So if you think about plants the way I do, I think of plants, and it makes my wife cringe because she's a botanist too, and she teaches botany, and so she doesn't like the way I say this, but I want to say it to you. Plants eat carbon dioxide. The greatest food source in the world is the atmosphere, and plants eat carbon dioxide. They take it in, they turn it into sugars, okay? Most plants do that in the daytime. CAM plants take in carbon dioxide at night. I just think that's fascinating. So as you walk down the street of LA, there are plants around you that not only are doing their respiration thing, they're busy building a whole reservoir of carbon dioxide, which will not be used till tomorrow when there's sunlight. So plants are busy at night and are busy in the darkness. We've only known this in the last 50 years. This is all fairly recent knowledge for humans. And it's made a difference in our world. For example, what if you want to grow wheat or crops in a drier place? Perhaps you can insert the genetics for CAM into those crops, and you can reverse their cycles and turn them into night eaters. So, okay. Thanks very much.
I'm not texting someone. I'm looking for my bird app. I might play you some calls later. Yeah. Well, thank you, Bill, for inviting me. And like many of you, I was stuck on the freeway, throwing things around my car in anger this morning. But we're survivors here in LA, and only the strong survive, which is kind of a theme of my talk. And so you guys made it. Just, I guess by way of background, I actually haven't read the bio in the brochure about me, but I just confirmed Bill and I were actually at this conference at Cal State Northridge in 1997 when I started grad school the first time around. And some of the people probably here were there or are still working in the field, so it's just great. I mean, we haven't aged a year, and it's amazing that we're still here doing the same thing. And yeah, I think Mike Davis was at that conference. 10 years before that, when I was in high school, I was asked to join the advisory board of Friends of the LA River by Lewis McAdams, who's worked for many years on the LA River. And so this topic of Los Angeles and nature in LA is something I've been thinking about for a long time, with very little monetary success. All right, well, let's get started. Nightbirds of LA. So here we are in LA at night, ironically. Over 500 bird species have been sighted in LA County. There are about 150 nesting bird species. Now remember, the county is not just LA, as we have to explain to our friends from out of town. It does extend over the San Gabriel Mountains into the Mojave Desert. So a lot of those birds are up there and north of us, but a lot are here in the Basin. We have dozens of natural areas scattered around LA. Some are protected, some are not. So to make it in LA, we gotta beat them or join them. And so the birds we'll be talking about have done one of those two things. They've, to survive, pushed out other species or maybe just remained common while coexisting with other species. So you've maybe seen some of these around town, maybe even in your backyard or deck. These are some of the most common birds in LA. I should really update this info. It's from 2014, but the pattern still holds. Has anyone seen hummingbirds around town? You guys have seen hummingbirds. So there are two species of hummingbirds, the orange one and the green one, as I tell my students. The green one is the Annas, and that used to be all over the place. And it's been replaced gradually by this bruiser from the Channel Islands, the Allen's hummingbird, the orange one. And the orange one made it to the Palos Verdes Peninsula in the 80s and now is swept across and is already breeding in Corona and Riverside and Lancaster, and it's doing very well. And we get about twice as many Allens these days. The inflection point was around 2012 when we started seeing more Allens on the annual Christmas count in Los Angeles. Well, let's take a walk down memory lane, as we've done in this conference today. This is from Harry Swarth, the field notes of this naturalist Swarth, who collected a lot of birds and in the early 1900s. And he published this remarkable paper on his ranch. His ranch was like in the Westlake district, west of downtown. So here's what it would have looked like. Oh, here we are at USC. I don't think any of you would remember this scene. My mom here in the audience only graduated in 1964 from SC, so that's a little before her time even. When it was a ranch, west of town, ranch land, grassland, very different from today. But where can we find this stuff now? Well, we have to go south. So I really like Jim Folsom's map of the light. Did anyone notice Baja California being this huge black peninsula? This is only about 2 hours south of the border, and this is what the landscape in LA looked like. So you can drive to it, get insurance. Even Pasadena, with the poppy fields up against the San Gabriels, doesn't look like that today. It looks like that today. So what changed? A lot changed. We have more trees, different shrubs, less open space. The mountains are still there, but the flats have changed. But it has a lot of owls, not quite as many as Harry Potter, but still a lot. And I'm going to be describing some of the results from our Griffith Park raptor survey that we've done through Friends of Griffith Park over the last 3 years. And every year we have volunteer monitors that monitor about 60 hawk and owl nests. Here they are. Secret information, so I'm going to move on. Don't take a picture of that. All right, so the owls around LA. Well, let's go back to Harry Swarth's time when there wasn't much here except nature. Barn owl, all over the place. Long-eared owl, well, that was really common in the willow regions. the willow regions in Grinnell's book, and Grinnell was a Pasadena resident for many years, the willow regions were Artesia and Compton. And Artesia and Compton turned into the dairy fields of LA, but prior to the dairy industry, that was the bottomlands of LA. And it was a massive willow sump, basically from like, Carson, northeast, east to Compton, Artesia, down to the base of the Palos Verdes Peninsula, through Los Alamitos, which means little cottonwoods. Anyway, short-eared owl, pretty common. Screech owl, common in the oaks. The oak zone was that band along the San Gabriel Mountains, which was also called the Mesa Zone by these early naturalists. Great horned owl, they expressed concern about it was getting rarer every year, scarcer every year, so maybe dying out. And then burrowing owl all over the place. Bixby, does anyone know Bixby? Long Beach? You all know that. Bixby Knolls. South Clearwater, that's kind of a deep cut. I didn't know where that was, but yes, it's in that area. Particularly numerous. Well, then we move ahead, 80 years. Barn owl, still widespread in suburban residential areas. Long-eared owls, pretty much circling the drain. Short-eared's pretty much gone. Screech owls, still around. But look at that, great horned owl got much more common. Now it's everywhere. But then burrowing owl changed. Burrowing owl, quite local, found in agricultural grassland areas. So when this was written in 81, there was still agriculture going on in south of downtown, in places like Carson and even Compton, Garden Groves, that area, but no longer. So today we've still got barn owls around. Anyone seen a barn owl? I don't know if this is going to work. I got some calls on my phone. We might get horrible feedback, but let's see. I don't know. Hear that sound? You hear that at night around LA. Here's what it looks like. If you drive around, you might see this in your headlights, and people report this as snowy owls. You can hear that in May and June if you live near palm trees or cypress trees. It's a weird sounding bird. So here's where they actually live. They live up in these palm trees. This is an active roost I found last year, secret location in Sherman Oaks. But honestly, doesn't that look like everywhere in Sherman Oaks? So chances are there's a lot of barn owls. Huh? That's your street. Yeah. Have you heard them? Yeah. All right. N equals 1, we've solved the theory. There are barn owls in Sherman Oaks. This is from Griffith Park. This is just a roost up in a pine tree. He's sitting in front of, I think, a raven nest. I don't know. Well, this is amazing. So Claire Martyr Kenyon, some of you may know her. She lives in Mount Washington. She's a naturalist and activist. While we were doing the first year of the raptor survey, she emailed and said, Dan, I do have a screech owl in my yard. Are you interested? Sure. So here's what they produce. You can see that little guy on the lower left. And they actually nested in a hole up in her roof. So you can see that little cavity. I don't know why that thing was built in her roof, but it was. And so she's one of the few people I know who has a backyard screech owl in LA. So that's nice. I'm sure that's what it sounds like. It's this ping pong ball. Now, screech owls don't screech. That's a common misconception. They don't screech, but they live in oaks, and that's not sitting in an oak. That's, I think, a Chinese tallow tree. Jim, maybe? Huh? Oh, ficus, yeah, Ficus benjamini. Yeah, okay. So a non-native tree they will sit in. They also nest up in palm trees like the barn owls. Great horned owl. Well, Grinnell was wrong. You can't, even if you're the great Grinnell, you can't predict everything about birds. And it turns out that great horns are very common now in LA, and they've adapted very well to the urban ecosystem. Yeah, rats, squirrels. So at night, hear that? That deep hooting. Then the male responding, the male's higher pitched, female. The male also has that doubled note on the second note. That's kind of cool. Okay, so where do they nest? They don't nest in holes at all. They nest in old hawk and raven nests. So there's a Griffith Park nest, the owl standing by, and that cute little fledgling. Now, the fledglings aren't that little. When they leave the nest, well, when they're born, they're little, but then when they leave the nest, they're actually a little larger than the adults because they got to fatten up. And it doesn't look much like a horned owl, but because it doesn't have many, it doesn't have horns, but it has all that downy feathers, so that's how you know it's a fledgling. So in our Griffith Park raptor survey, we've just been learning all sorts of things about the hawks and owls of LA. One thing is that great horned owls start nesting really early. They'll start displaying and communicating with each other in the middle of winter, and then they'll lay eggs. The earliest we've suspected is early February. So they've got birds out of the nest by the end of April, and all summer long they're just sort of flying around. The young are flying kind of quietly, which is kind of interesting. They will reuse nests, and this was one of these burning questions that we all had starting this raptor survey is like, are these birds nesting in the same place? And it turns out that red tails are reusing a lot of nests. Red shoulders are too. Great horns are too. But then other birds just aren't, like Cooper's hawk just move their nests from spot to spot every year within the same territory. And then we have that rare burrowing owl, the poor burrowing owl that was once all over Bixby when there was a Bixby, but now is just not around. So occasionally every fall we'll get one that turns up in a weird spot. So this was from Ranger Albert Torres, who some of you may have met. He died this year very tragically, but served many years as the chief ranger for Griffith Park. And he was really into birds. So he emailed me this, and he's like, Dan, ever hear of a burrowing owl living in a drain in Griffith Park? I was like, no, well, there it is. So that was October. It moved on. And Brad Rumble of Esperanza, which is near downtown, sent me this photo from his elementary school where he's a principal. And this bird has now come back. I think it's back this year again. So this was in 2016. So, 3 years later, it keeps coming back. And they may be roosting or burrowing up on the roofs of buildings in the area. We're not really sure where this thing lives. Burrowing owls, probably about 10 years. So yeah, they can come back. And this guy, individual, is sort of adapted for life in downtown where he won't go near the ground because there are cars and kids and cats. But it's sitting in these low trees. I think this year, he had it like on top of, some recycled paper bins or something. I don't know. Strange places. Anyone seen this? This is a common poorwill. So this one is going to be found at the outskirts of town. It doesn't like the city. I'll try to find its call. And if you've gone on night hikes, or if you are lucky enough to live in the hills and have a deck, you can hear this thing. There we go. It's a real familiar call up in the canyons in the summertime. And it's crepuscular. What is it now? What is it? Scotobiological. It's a very scotobiological individual. Oops, sorry. So is this one, lesser nighthawk. Lesser nighthawk is much rarer than the poorwill. We'll talk about that in a sec. Common poorwill chicks. So I found these chicks while I was bushwhacking up by the Hollywood sign, there's now a vineyard there planted by a vindictive owner between the Hollywood sign and Hollywood Reservoir. Right, before the vineyard, you could kind of walk up there, and there's still poorwills, I think, nesting in Griffith Park. And then the other side of the trail or that little path where I found it was this. That was the adult trying to do a distraction display. So this is a close-up of the eye, classical nocturnal bird eye, right, dark. They have an orange sheen, so if you drive country roads at night, you might see that orange color. So back to lesser nighthawk. So this thing lives only in one habitat in LA, and unfortunately that habitat is super rare. It's alluvial fan scrub. It's all those bouldery, big washes that come out of the San Gabriel Mountains, which are mostly gone. You know, there are a couple left. The big one in LA is called Big Tahunga Wash, and it's crossed by Foothill Boulevard and the 210 freeway. So it's hard to miss if you drive through Tahunga. And they still have breeding lesser nighthawks. Here's another example of its habitat from a study we did out in the Cucamonga area. So this is Cucamonga Creek, which passes by the west side of the town of Upland. And you can't really see this from the 210 freeway, but where they're building those new malls east of Claremont, upstream of that is this wash. And that's where this thing lives. So what does the future hold for the raptors of LA? Well, I predict that barn owl and great horned owl will stay common. They're doing very well in suburbia and even urbia. Screech owl and poorwill should probably stick around. We really are not seeing any evidence of decline of those two species. If you've got any kind of oak trees around you and maybe some undeveloped hillsides, you should have screech owls in your neighborhood. And just as an example, this part of town has pretty much all the stuff except for nighthawk. This is the trail at Franklin Canyon above Beverly Hills, and it's got a full complement of all these species. We just have had bad luck finding nests. But some of the rare stuff could be restored, like burrowing owl and nighthawk. We're kind of running out of space for nighthawk, but they're still around. Burrowing owl, it seems like if you fence off an area that's flat, you will attract a burrowing owl. We even had a long-eared owl come into Griffith Park when they fenced off the bird sanctuary during the fire, or after the fire in 2008. So it just shows by keeping nature's greatest enemy, man, out of the area, you could attract some owls. That's a topic for another conference. All right, let's see if this works. Let's hope it works. It's a burrowing owl. Can anyone guess where this is? So this is from the Bay Foundation. They're doing some restoration of the El Segundo Dunes. I'll play it again. And while we were out there, we noticed, there's a burrowing owl living under a flap in the cement. So, try that again. So they live under here. The early accounts of this area by von Blocher, who was at USC in 1932, mentioned that burrowing owl lived under the sidewalks in Playa del Rey. So the population was much less then, a lot more people now, except this fenced area, the El Segundo Dunes, miraculously still supports the last burrowing owls in LA. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Come, all of our panelists to come sit back up here. And then I think for the purposes of recording, if you want to ask a question, you could raise your hand and then I'm going to bring you the microphone. So in the few minutes that we have, are there any questions? Yes.
I was just wondering how important is the nightscape in impacting the cam plants? I mean, how I heard a little that you were suggesting that, but I just wanted to know the degree to which it's impacting those cam plants.
In this one zone? Oh, yeah. So I went and did a Google Scholar searches all over, and it seems that the only thing the nightscape is doing with plants is it's affecting some of the timing, but not in a way that's going to cause huge problems. Remembering that most of the plants in our urban environment are also non-native, and so but the increased warmth means that plants are actually maybe growing a little bit more. The warmer nights, there's a funny thing that happens with plants. You can reverse temperatures, or change the relative day and night temperature, and actually change how they grow. Commercial businesses will grow plants warmer at night and cooler in the daytime and cause them to be more compact. So you can actually grow, but I haven't read anything that causes alarm as to productivity or existence.
Other questions?
How do nocturnal plants like know when it's night and when it's day?
How do the plants know when it's night and when it's day?
Oh, when I was in college, they had just discovered a thing called phytochrome, and it was the beginning and the end of all research. But now there are 5 major groups of light sensors, and you got to remember that there's a band of light. There's a band of electromagnetic energy called the rainbow, and everything that happens biologically happens in that band. We see in that band other plants can use energy in that band, and so plants can use far red light and red light. As the day changes, as we go from daylight to darkness, they can track chemically how long certain forms that have been affected by light, blue lights, red lights, they can track how long those forms, how much of that form exists, and that will impact the hormonal relationships within the plant. So literally, as you change the number of darkness dark versus light hours, the plant senses how much darkness and how much light there was, and it will change, it will respond with different growth patterns. But it's across the board, and every time we turn around, another sensor has shown up. And then you complicate that by having temperature sensors too. And since daytime is warm and nighttime is cool, it's hard to tease those apart.
We have time for one more question.
That was a fantastic panel. Thank you. I have a question for you, Bryan. As a culture, we don't tell stories about our skies anymore. And I wonder if you might speculate with us about what cultural and social benefits might exist if we did know stories about our skies and tell them to each other, as happened in the Chumash and so many other civilizations.
Yeah, you're right on to it's one of the deepest, most meaningful human experiences that we modern people have been cut off from. That would be the extended, traditional, ancestral tale that would be told in exactly the same way, too, as one's grandparent might have told it. And in many societies, not just Native American, but around the world, that tradition still lives, and yet it's lost to us. It has so many dimensions to it, because it would be one that would unify large groups of people. It'd be synchronized to some kind of sacred calendar, and it would bring together different family members and bring into the story not only like astronomical themes, but connecting those people to their environment around them, invoking those sort of first people, the creators of the universe, and describing the direct descent of the current people to those. And in that way, not only are people connected to each other, but they're connected deeply to the environment that they live in. And these tales reinforce that in a beautiful, wonderful way. I've had the privilege of hearing some of these storytellers bring those back to life. And there's one recording that I sometimes use with my students. A fellow named Gerard Sanakwa put together a planetarium show called Echoes of the Night, where he retells a lot of these star tales from his people, the Abenaki people up near Quebec. And it's just beautiful to hear the rhythms and the intonation and the way in which different characters are invoked. And we've lost all of that, replacing it with Twitter and YouTube and television, which are, of course, very poor substitutes.
I think we need to wrap it up there to move into our next panel, but join me in thanking our panelists one more time.